Now, it's been a little while since we've got back kind of into the, I say, normal swing of the text here. We obviously had Brother Max last week, and then the week before that, we took a week to kind of explain some concepts that Paul is dealing with here in a little bit more depth. So it's been, I guess, 3 or 4 weeks since we were just working our way through the chapter. But Paul has been saying quite a great deal about our suffering and beyond the suffering, the hope that we have and able to endure this suffering. And then, of course, it brings us to verse 28, which was where we left off several weeks ago. But let's just go ahead and read 28 through 30 here. It says, "And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose." And then we pick it up this morning in 29. "For whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom he did predestinate, them he also called, and whom he called, them he also justified, and whom he justified, them he also glorified." Now, what we have here, I'll talk about this a little bit more later on, oftentimes has been referred to in a variety of ways, but some kind of variation of the golden chain of redemption. You may have heard something along those lines. And that's what we see here in verses 29 and 30. And I think the ultimate point that Paul is trying to make in this, yes, there's various aspects of our salvation that we see, we learn. We'll talk about those this morning. But the grand point that Paul is making here is that God does not do anything without a purpose. God is not purposeless in anything. He had a purpose in creating the universe. He had a purpose in the plan of salvation that he came up with. He had a purpose in sending his Son. He had a purpose in killing and raising his Son. And what our text shows us is that fundamentally he had a purpose in saving us. His saving us, we might think, because all things are done for God's glory, but we might think that the glory of God is the ultimate purpose of our salvation. And here we see that whereas it does do that, and I don't diminish that, our salvation does bring glory to God. What we see here is that there's other purposes, I guess you could say, for the fact that God has saved us. And we see these preeminently in verse 29, but we see that he saved us to conform us, and he saved us to glorify us. And so what we understand about the God that we serve is that he is sovereign, he is omniscient, he is omnipotent, and given these fundamental aspects of his nature and his character, he does not do anything that does not serve a purpose. We don't serve an arbitrary God. He has there's a reason why he moves. There's a reason why he does, and that reason, again, with regards to salvation, we see this morning, is for our glorious benefit. And so we'll see this as we work our way through this morning. And so again, we left off with verse 28, which is a beautiful promise given to believers that he works all things together for good. And then the second half of verse 28 shows us who he's working all things together for good for. He says, "To them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose." And so this is the group of people that verses 29 and 30 are referencing. This is the group of people who these promises continue to be spoken of. And so it is about that particular group that we read in verse 29, "For whom he did foreknow." Who is it that he foreknew? He foreknew them that love God, them that are called according to his purpose. "For whom he did foreknow, he did also predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren." Now, when I was putting this together, I was kind of debating with myself how much I should get into the aspects of foreknowledge and predestination, because we really dealt with those in earnest a couple of weeks ago. And we talked about those in detail, what it is, what they mean. And so I kind of felt if I did all that again, we would just kind of be rehashing the same thing. So I'm not going to go into all the details of foreknowledge and predestination again. We just did that a couple of weeks ago. But what I do want to say, I just want to point out one thing. It should be stated that in this particular verse, these particular terms are in reference, again, to that group at the end of verse 28. And why I think that's important to state is because those who love God, those who are called, are Christians. That's what verse 28, we talked about this several weeks ago. Verse 28, those who love God, those who are called, those are speaking of Christians. And so the people whom God foreknew, the people whom God predestinated, are not being predestinated to salvation in verse 29. The people are being predestinated, verse 29, are already Christians, and these Christians have been predestined for a specific purpose. Right? That's what verse 29 shows us. And so he foreknew and he predestined Christians for what? To be conformed. He foreknew and he predestined Christians to be conformed to the image of his Son for the purposes of giving Jesus preeminence, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. And so, yes, there are ways in which foreknowledge and predestination work towards salvation. But I said this a couple weeks ago. I'll say it again. I really don't think that's what Paul is speaking of here in verse 29, because he gives us the purpose for the predestination, and the purpose is conforming to the image of his Son. And so when God saves us, one of the reasons, amongst many, and Paul obviously is not giving us an exhaustive list here in verses 29 and 30. He's not telling us, here's every reason why God saves you. But two reasons he gives us. Number one, we are saved, we are foreknown, we are predestined for the purpose of being conformed to the image of his Son. Being conformed to the image of his Son. About this particular phrase, I'll quote Hybrid. He said that this blessed hope that believers will be conformed to the image of his own Son explains God's dealings with them as his chosen sons in this present age. He is ever at work to produce the moral image of Christ in them. All that now comes into their lives, he uses for their good to further that glorious goal. His aim for them now is not to make them happy, materially prosperous, or famous, but to make them Christ-like. He now uses all things, the sad as well as the glad, the painful as well as the pleasant, the things that perplex and disappoint, as well as the things they eagerly strive and pray for, to further his eternal purpose for them. In his infinite wisdom, he knows what is needed to bring about that transformation. And so this actually sheds light for us on the promise, that wonderful promise of verse 28. Why is God working all things together for good to them that love him? Why is he doing this? Again, he doesn't do this arbitrarily. He's not just doing this because, well, they're mine, and so now I'm going to bless them. He's doing this for the purposes, you might say, of sanctification, but he's doing this for the purposes of conforming them into the very image of his Son. Now, what is the best thing that could happen for Christians? The best thing that could happen for Christians is that we become more Christ-like. That is the best thing that could happen to us and for us. And so for God to conform us into the image of his Son is quite literally the best thing he could do for us. And so this isn't a prideful thing. This isn't a selfish thing. This is a glorious thing for him to do, because the more Christ-like we are, the more we are, we're going to be blessed both in this life and in the life to come. The more Christ-like we are, the better image we are portraying. The more light we are, the more salt we are. The more Christ-like we are, the better picture of his Son we are giving to the world. And so there are a myriad of benefits that come with being conformed into his image. And so that's why verse 28 exists. Verse 28 exists because God is using these things. He's working all these things together for this particular purpose, to conform us to the image of his Son. But first we see here we must be conformed. We have to be conformed. And so to me, this is a particular comfort. I believe that this is a comfort, to know that God doesn't just save you and then just leave you. He doesn't save you, redeem you, justify, make you legally a child of God, adopt you into his family, and then just say, go on, figure it out. Right? I hope things work out well for you. No, he does all those things, and then he moves alongside of you, and he continues to work in your life. His salvation of us is only the beginning of what is an eternal relationship. And so here we see the one of the ways in which that relationship works. This is a relationship where here and now, on into eternity, I will add, but both here and now and then, he conforms us to the image of his Son. Now, to be conformed is to be brought or to be made into a similar form. That's what the word means, to be brought or to be made into a similar form. And here that which we are being brought into or being made into is the form of the image of Christ. The form of the image of Christ. Now, I'll say this. Nowhere in the Scriptures are we told exactly what that means. Nowhere in the Scriptures are we told we're being conformed to the image of his Son, and here's what that image is. Here's what that means. Here's how that practically works out for you. However, we can know some things about it. The only other time that the word for conform here, the only other time that word is used in the New Testament is in Philippians 3:21. In Philippians 3:21, it says, "Who shall change our vile body, that it may be fashioned like unto his." And that's the same word there, fashioned. "It may be fashioned like unto his glorious body, according to the working whereby he is able even to subdue all things unto himself." But we're told that we will be fashioned like unto his body. This is one aspect of being conformed into his image. Now, this does not mean that in eternity we're going to look exactly like Jesus, that there's just going to be millions of people in heaven who all look exactly the same. That's not what that means. But that it means that we will have a body that is similar in the form of Jesus' body. What that means is we will have, like him, a glorified body. I've said this in the past, and I believe this. I think the Bible teaches this. I think we will still be us. We will be recognizably us. When we get to heaven, Brother Lynn is going to be recognizably Lynn. Now, what exactly that's going to look like, I don't know. It'll be a glorified version of what Lynn is now. And so this is something we can all look forward to. And so we're not going to look exactly like Jesus, but we will have a form that is similar to Jesus. But I will say this. I think that is just one aspect of what it means to be conformed into the image of Christ, because I don't think it's solely a physical thing. It's not less than that. It is at least that, but I don't think it's only that. I think there's more. We know, you go all the way back to the book of Genesis, Adam was created in the image of God. He was created in the image of God. And then through his fall, now stay with me on this, through his fall, we now have been marred with the image of Adam. And so there's still the image of God. All of us are image bearers of God. But alongside of that now, through the fall, is we're bearing both the image of God and the image of Adam. Right? And so we have both. It is only in salvation then where both the sin of Adam and the image of Adam are undone. And so to be conformed into his image then is to be what Adam was unable to be, which is to be fundamentally like his son, to be Christ-like. And so we're not just going to have a body that is like his. We will. That's promised to us. We're not just going to have a body like his. We're going to be like him. That's not just physical. That's spiritual in nature as well. John said this. He says, "When he shall appear, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is." Again, is he just talking physically? No, that's not what that means. He's saying we will be like him in our nature, fundamentally in our spiritual character. We will be like him. Now, this process will be completed in eternity, but it has begun now. To say that this is only something that happens in the future. There's some people who come to this text and say that Paul really is only talking eternally here. That these aren't current promises for the believer, but I disagree. In fact, Paul in Philippians 1:6, he says, "Being confident of this very thing, that he which hath begun a good work in you will perform it until the day of Jesus Christ." It has begun now. It began the day, the moment you became a child of God. He began to work in your life. He began that process of confirmation. He's molding you and he's making you more each and every day like his son. Now, sanctification, I mentioned that word earlier. Sanctification is a work that ends in glory. It is perfected in glory, but it is a work that began the day that you were saved, and it continues as God continuously conforms you into that which you should be, that which is fundamentally like his son. Again, you won't be his son as far as you won't be Jesus, but you will be like him. Yes, physically so, but spiritually so as well. Again, that starts here. It cannot be completed here. Because again, that image of Adam was undone the moment we were saved, but it still hangs on like someone at the very end of their life. It's been dealt a death blow, but that death is not finalized until we go into eternity. And so to be conformed into the image of his son is again something that began the moment you were saved. It is happening right now as we speak. It will continue to happen as you live in this life, and then it will be finalized, perfected the moment we reach eternity. And all this is done at the end of verse 29. All this is done that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. That he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Now, This points us towards eternity as the ultimate application. I said I disagree with those who say that all of this is only speaking of eternity. I don't agree with that. I do agree that eternity is the ultimate application of this, because it's when all of this is finalized and perfected. But again, this is the ultimate application of Paul's point. It is our resurrection that makes Christ the firstborn. It is our resurrection that makes Christ the first fruits. We see this in other passages. 1 Corinthians 15, it says, "But now is Christ risen from the dead and become the first fruits of them that slept." Because he rose, we have a promise and a seal of our own resurrection one day. As he rose, so too will those who are his brethren. As he rose, so too are those who are the sons of God. However, Christ being the firstborn, we have to understand this. This is something that really doesn't exist to the degree that it existed at the time that Paul wrote this. But to be the firstborn is not just a chronological note. Yes, Jesus is the first chronologically, but when the Bible uses that terminology, firstborn, it speaks of so much more than just chronology. It speaks of position or honor or authority, right? To be the firstborn in the Jewish culture and in the Jewish context meant a whole lot more than just chronologically he's older than his siblings. That's not what that means. There was authority, there was a position that existed with the firstborn that did not exist with the others. He was the one who carried on the family's name, who carried on the family's honor. The blessings of the firstborn were bestowed upon the firstborn son. And this is what Paul means here when he says that he's the firstborn among many brethren. He doesn't just mean that Jesus was the first chronologically of more to come. I mean, that's a true statement, but that's not what he means. He's not just one of many. He's the firstborn among many. Right? And so this is a positional statement. He has a position of preeminence, and he should be worshipped as one who has the position of preeminence. But we see this again in a couple of places. Colossians 1, it says, "And he is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he might have the preeminence." That's exactly what we're told here in Romans. He's the firstborn, and he says that he's the firstborn in Colossians, he might have the preeminence. Philippians 2:9. "Wherefore God also hath highly exalted him, and given him a name which is above every name." Why? Because he's the firstborn. Right? Again, this isn't just speaking of a timeline of events, but this is bestowing upon Jesus the position, the authority, the preeminence of being the firstborn. And as I said, he ought to be worshipped as such. And then we get into verse 30. Verse 30 says, "Moreover." Now that term, moreover, takes us back to the beginning of verse 29. I'll explain that in a minute. So moreover, whom he did predestinate, them he also called. And whom he called, them he also justified. And whom he justified, them he also glorified. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is people refer to this in various ways, but as the golden chain of redemption. You could say that in verse 29, Paul began to speak of that chain. He foreknew, he predestined, and then he broke off. And instead of continuing the chain, he said, let me tell you what the end of this chain means. Let me tell you where this chain is leading. Let me tell you the purpose of this chain. And then in verse 30, he comes back to fill in the missing links. And that's what we have here in verse 30. And so he said in verse 29, he spoke of of God's foreknowledge, he spoke of God's predestination, and then he picks that back up in verse 30. "Moreover, whom he did predestinate, them he also called. Whom he called, he justified. Whom he justified, he glorified." And so there's a sequence of events here. Now, it's happening in some of these simultaneously, but there is a sequence of events here. There's foreknowledge, there's predestination, there's calling, there's justification, there's glorification. And so there's a logical sequence taking place here that Paul refers to here. And so first God foreknew, he then predestined, he then calls, he then justifies, he then glorifies. And so we've already looked at foreknowledge, we've already looked at predestination. So the next, again, to use the terminology, link in the chain, the next one would be the fact that God is calling us, whom he predestined, he called. Now, we know, Ephesians tells us this, we are dead in our trespasses and our sins. Now, obviously, that's not speaking of physical death, although it leads to physical death. But what that fundamentally is referencing is our spiritual death. Spiritually, we are dead. We are born, every human being is born into a state of death. Every human being is born physically into a spiritual state of death. And so being dead in our sins, we are not only incapable of saving ourselves, it's why I can't save myself spiritually, because spiritually I'm a dead man. I can't save myself, but it goes beyond that. Not only can I not save myself, I don't even know that I need to be saved without God calling me. I don't even know that I need that. Again, I've talked about this many times in the past. Nobody just wakes up one day and of their own accord, without the calling of God, knows and thinks to themselves, I need salvation. It doesn't happen that way. There must be a calling first. Now, the most well-known verse on this will be John 6:44. Jesus speaking, no man can come to me except the Father which has sent me draw him, and I will raise him up at the last day. You could say that drawing and the calling is really the same concept. And so Jesus says, no man comes to the Father comes to me except the Father draws him. The Father must draw him. Now, this can happen in a variety of ways. It doesn't happen the same way all the time. It could happen through the simple means of evangelism. You tell your neighbor about Christ. You tell your coworker, your whatever. You out there and you tell somebody. That's probably the most familiar way to us. But it can happen, so many times these missionaries, for instance, they go into these other places of the world. They bring with them Bibles. They try to distribute Bibles. Somebody picks up that Bible and they read. God can draw them simply through reading the Word of God. We have an example of this in the book of Acts. You have the Ethiopian who is reading the Bible. He doesn't really understand what he's reading, but he wants to. Right? And so God sends the gospel to that man, right? And so he was drawn through the Word of God. Romans 1 speaks of creation itself as a means of, at the very least, showing people that there is a God that exists, that he is clearly seen in the things that he has made. And so again, these things aren't enough in and of themselves, but through these means and the gospel, right, this is what draws a person to come to know Christ. And this, again, not exhaustive. There's other ways that it could happen. But God uses these means to draw a person. Sometimes, I was talking to Ruth about this just yesterday. Sometimes God uses the death of a loved one to draw you. It opens your eyes to the truth. And again, this is something we all know. We all know there's a time coming for me to die. We know that. But when it's your loved one in that coffin and you're looking death in the face, right, it opens your eyes to this reality, and it makes, I can tell you just firsthand how many times a funeral has been the direct means that God has used to draw somebody to Him. It happens often. And so God can use various means, but God must draw you. God must call you. Again, you can't do it on your own. And so God calls you. And then the chain continues. And whom He called, them He also justified. Now, I won't spend a whole lot of time talking about our justification for the simple reason that Paul has already kind of spent several chapters dealing with this particular topic. We've talked about justification already at length, but just kind of as a recap. Justification is the result of our salvation. We are justified because we have been made new. We are justified because the righteousness of Christ has been imputed to us. And so justification is the result of being saved. And so justification is a legal standing. I can stand before God even though I'm guilty, even though I have committed sins, even though I stand before Him perfectly deserving of the punishment that should come upon me, because God has basically swapped my sinfulness with Christ's righteousness. He looks upon me as though I had never sinned, and legally speaking, you don't punish the innocent. Right? And so that's how that works out as far as our justification is concerned. But I do want you to notice or to see here the inevitability of our justification. There's no wiggle room in this chain. There's no if statements. There's no maybe statements. No, he foreknew, He predestined, He called, and He justified. It doesn't say maybe He did, or if you do this, He'll do that. No, it just happens. And so this is an inevitability. Those who God foreknew and predestined and called, He justified. That's what it tells us here. To be justified is to have a right standing. Again, legally we are granted righteousness that we didn't earn or that we didn't produce. And so this is guaranteed. This is the point I want to make. This is guaranteed to every Christian. There is no second-class citizen in heaven because we are all standing on the same foundation. Nobody in heaven, whenever we finally get there, there will not be one single person there who earned heaven more than you did, because none of us earned it. There will not be one single person who did more to get there than you did, because none of us did anything to get there. In fact, we actively worked against it. God had to bring us there. And so we all are on the same footing. Now, we may have done more. Once we're on that foundation, this is what Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 3. Some people build upon that foundation more than other people build on that foundation. But the foundation is the same for all of us. That foundation is Jesus and the gospel. Nobody has a different one. And so this is guaranteed. We all stand on the basis of our justification, which is, again, something that God only can do for all of his sons. And then the last one here in verse 30. Them he also called, he also justified, and them whom he justified, them he also glorified. So you could say this is the last link in the chain, as it were. This is the moment to be glorified. This is the moment we become fully conformed. We become fully conformed. Now again, that process has already started. You are being conformed now. But the time is going to come when you will be conformed. The time has come when that process will end. The moment we begin our eternal praise of the preeminent firstborn of God is the time when we will be glorified. Now, again, I want you to notice this. Our glorification is as inevitable as our justification. In other words, you won't get the one and not the other. It will not take place that way. In fact, and this is something that I did not know until this past week, I found this fascinating. All of the verbs in verses 29 and 30 are in the same tense. All of the verbs in verses 29 and 30 are in the same tense. Foreknow, predestinate, called, justified, glorified, all of them are written in what is called the aorist active indicative. The aorist active indicative. This is what it was in the Greek. The aorist, when you translate an aorist verb from Greek to English, generally speaking, it's almost always past tense. It is translated in a past tense. The active means that the subject is the one performing the action. God is the one justifying. God is the one calling. It's not us doing it. God's the one doing it. Indicative just means simply it's a statement of fact. This isn't somebody's question. This isn't somebody's hypothesis. This is an actual fact that has taken place. And so when you put those three together, this is a statement of fact that God has, not will, but that God has predestined, called, justified, and glorified. Right? All of this is very fascinating to me because, again, because of the aorist, it's written in the past tense. And so even though our glorification does not take place until we reach eternity, the fact that it will happen is so sure that Paul wrote about it as if it's in the past tense. It's already taken place. As far as God is concerned, you are as good as glorified, even though it hasn't yet taken place. And so again, there is an inevitability that takes place here. Well, I don't want to get ahead of myself here. Some have asked, and I just want to answer this question really quick. Some have asked why Paul didn't specifically speak of sanctification. And so this is a question that's been asked about this text for a long time. Paul goes straight from justification to glorification. Right? Well, there seems to be something missing here, Paul. Why don't you refer to sanctification? I don't want to just give my own words here because he says this so well. I'll quote Bruce here. He says, the difference between sanctification and glory is one of degree only and not of kind. Sanctification is conformity to the mind or image of Christ here and now. Glory is the perfect conformity to the image of Christ there and then. Sanctification is glory begun. Glory is sanctification consummated. Paul looks forward to the consummation work of grace, a consummation guaranteed by its inception. In other words, what he's saying is there is no glory